What they say here is, in fact, a truthful statement. And in fact, it's not all the way truthful, because he's not just the King of the Jews, he's the King of kings. He's the King of all creation, Jew and Gentile. So that is the focal point of this unit, and we'll see that as we get to it. So first we see in verse 28 that they strip Jesus. This is an embarrassing thing. Even though it's in somewhat of a private area, this is still a somewhat public spectacle that's going on. They strip Jesus and they dress him in what Matthew describes as a scarlet robe. This is interesting because if you're familiar with the other gospel accounts, in particular Mark's gospel account, there's some differences here. The word that's used and is translated as robe is, in particular, it's a specific word. It's only used in the New Testament twice, and in both times are here in Matthew 27. This is the cloak that Roman soldiers would have worn. And the Greek word is klaumus. And so that's just it's the word that refers to the garb that the Roman soldiers would wear. And so what they are doing here essentially is they're taking something that would have been in close proximity, one of their robes, and they put it on Jesus in a mocking sort of way. But it's interesting, and perhaps this explains the difference between Matthew and Mark. Because Matthew describes this as a scarlet robe, whereas Mark describes it as purple. Some view that as a contradiction. Others will say, well, scarlet and purple, they're close enough to where you can kind of get the gist of it. But what's interesting here is it's actually possible, given the wording of this. We know Matthew's very intentional with his wording, and I would assume Mark is the same way. It's possible that this is not, in fact, a contradiction, but actually something that goes together, wearing both purple and scarlet. And I say this based on how the wording is here. In Matthew, we see that they stripped him and they put a scarlet robe on him. This is an outer sort of thing that you would wear. In Mark, it simply says they clothed him in a purple cloak. But the word cloak is not in there. That is something that is sort of implied. So it literally reads, they clothed him in purple. And so you can see it's possible for Jesus to have had purple clothes on, a purple tunic or a purple cloak, and then have the robe, which is scarlet, over top of that. And something that's interesting, Kaufman points this out. I didn't include the full quote on the screen, but what colors are the veil of the temple? They're blue and scarlet and purple. And so you have two of those colors mentioned in terms of the things that Jesus are wearing. I don't know if there's anything to that or not. We know that the idea of the veil is something that is pretty prominent. We'll see the veil get torn in two when Jesus breathes his final breath. The Hebrew writer elaborates on that point further, and perhaps we'll get to that when we read that. But for now, for the sake of time, we'll put that off for another time. So they put this robe on him, this scarlet robe, and then they put the crown of thorns on his head and they put a reed in his right hand. We're familiar with the idea of the right hand being the ruling hand. And this is something you read it in the Old Testament a lot, the right hand of God. You could do a study on that in and of itself, and I think we have in times past. We see here, this is the mockery. They put a robe on him that's sort of a kingly sort of attire. Then they put a crown of thorns on him. They put a reed in his right hand as if to have a staff that you rule with. We think of the crown of thorns and we think of that as being painful, and rightfully so. That's a very painful thing. I remember a few months ago, Jim, or maybe last year or the year before, he had an actual crown of thorns here, and just the weight of that on your head would have dug into your flesh, and it would have been very painful. And you could imagine the blood dripping down the side of his face and in front of him and so on. But it doesn't seem like the pain of that is the intention. That's a side effect of it. But it seems that what they're really wanting to do is to mock him. This is obviously a nefarious thing that they're doing. And this fits with the robe and it fits with the rod or the reed that they put in his hand. What they're doing essentially is playing dress up with Jesus. They say, well, he is supposedly a king. Let's dress him as a king. Let's embarrass him. Let's make fun of him in front of all these people to see. And so they are, of course, mocking him. They mock him not just by dressing him up, but then they mock him by gesture and then also by voice. The gesture that they do is they kneel before him. Kneeling is a sign of humility. It's something if you're before a magistrate, if you're before any sort of ruler, you kneel before them. And they do so here, but not in a sincere way, but in a mocking way. This isn't reverence, but rather ridicule. And then they mock, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." This is all very ironic, and we'll see this also with the charge that they put over Jesus' head on the cross, because ironically, they don't mean it, but what they're saying is factually correct in saying that he is the King of the Jews. And again, when you look at the chiastic structure of this, the statement that Jesus is the King of the Jews is the focal point of this entire small unit. What they are saying here is a truthful statement. And for Matthew's Jewish readers, reading this saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and it's repeated periodically. It was repeated during Jesus' trial. It's going to be eventually his charge that they put over his head. If you're Matthew's original readers, presumably a Jewish person in that period of time, perhaps making the choice, do I become a Christian, do I remain in Judaism? You read this and you can't help but think, he is the King of the Jews. What they're doing is so twisted and so wrong. This is the one that I need to follow. And so that remains the focal point of this unit here. And eventually, the mocking turns violent. They begin to physically assault Jesus, more so than they already have done. We see first that they spit on him. If you've ever been spat on, you realize firstly how gross that is, but you also realize how disrespectful that is. There's an entire episode of the sitcom Seinfeld centered around someone getting spat on, and it has Keith Hernandez in it and so on and so forth. It's a funny episode, but the whole episode focuses on someone getting spat on and how disrespectful that is, and there's a whole conspiracy behind it. Spitting on someone is an immense sign of disrespect. I think we are aware of that. That's something that has stood the test of time. You don't spit on someone unless you detest them or unless you're trying to show them disrespect. And that's what they're doing to Jesus here. They're disrespecting him. They're mocking him. But something else that's interesting about this, and we've seen this throughout the beginning of the passion narrative of Jesus, his suffering. This alludes to more prophecy, and in particular to Isaiah 50 and verse 6, that unit in Isaiah that depicts the suffering servant. This is drawn out again and again and again, and it'll be drawn out more. But notice what this says in Isaiah 50. It says, "I gave my back to those who strike." You could look back to when Jesus is scourged. That's particularly what happens there. That's how they scourge people. They did it to his back. He says, "My cheeks to those who pull out the beard." When Jesus says in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, to turn the other cheek, he's embodying that in this sequence of events here, and this is something else that Isaiah tells about here. He gave his back to those who strike and his cheeks to those who pull out the beard. And he says, "I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting." Jesus is fulfilling this prophecy as he fulfills all of these other prophecies. And so the mocking is violent. They spit on him, and then eventually they strike Jesus on the head. If you've ever been in a fight with somebody, whether it's in a playful way or maybe you're just mad at each other and you want to take out some frustration on each other, typically the head is off limits, because hitting someone in the head, you're susceptible to some pretty serious injuries. Well, they don't care. They don't care about Jesus' well-being. They're going to kill him anyway. And so they strike him on the head. And they do so with the very reed that they were already using to mock him. And keep in mind, there's already a crown of thorns on his head. And so they strike him again, first with the crown of thorns that they place on his head, and now with the reed. The crown is on his head, then the reed is on his head. The very things that make a king, they're using violently against Jesus and in a mocking sort of way. We went through that kind of quickly. Are there any comments or questions on the mockery of Jesus before we get to the crucifixion? Garfield?
I was being raised up My youth up, they would say, let no man spit upon you. I was told if they spit on you, you deck them. I mean, that was something I was taught from my youth up, because they know what such a great insult it is when you spit on somebody.
Yeah, Garfield talks about his upbringing, growing up, in his words, in the hills of Kentucky, and how spitting on someone is immensely disrespectful, and he was taught if someone spits on you, you deck them. That shows you how disrespectful that is, and it further shows the meekness of Christ to not do anything in return. Of course, he's being delivered to be crucified, but... So the time is here now. Jesus is taken, and he's going to be crucified. This is what not just Matthew's gospel, but the entire Bible has been building to this point, to the crucifixion of Christ, which will result in his death, which is the sacrificial death. We'll talk about the death next week, but for now he is going to be crucified. And so picking up in verse 32, it says, as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then the two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, and saying, You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. So there's a lot to unpack here. This is obviously a very significant event. First, before they actually crucify him, they're taking him to Golgotha. And they find a man of Cyrene named Simon. I don't think I included it here. I do not. There is actual, you read things in the Bible and people will say, well, people will challenge everything. Is that person real? Did that person really exist? There's actual archaeological evidence that this man of Cyrene named Simon existed. They found in the early 1900s, they found I forget the technical term, but it's a box of bones. And on the box is an inscription. And on the inscription it says, Alexander, son of Simon. And on the lid of the box it says, of Cyrene. In Mark, we read that this Simon of Cyrene had 2 sons. One named Alexander, the other named Rufus. It's believed that Rufus is also mentioned in Romans 16. It's believed that Mark mentions those 2 by name because they were significant people in the early church. I don't know if that is true or not. Point being, they have actually found the remains of one of Simon's sons, and it mentions Simon by name on the inscription of the box that they found him in. And you can look that up and you can read it. It's in Greek and Hebrew, if you can read those languages. But point being, it's an interesting thing to find this is a real person through history. This isn't some fairy tale. And so they find this man, Simon from Cyrene. He's believed to be in that area for the feast. And so he's there and they find him. And it says that they compel him, that strong language, they compel him to carry the cross of Jesus. It doesn't say they ask him to. It says they compel him. This is an emotional sort of appeal that they're making to Simon. And the implication in that is that Jesus can no longer carry it. And so he started to carry it as if you piece together the story from the other gospel accounts, he starts to carry it, he can't carry it any longer, and so they compel Simon to carry it the rest of the way. And you could obviously see that after what Jesus has been through, after being scourged, like we saw in verse 26, after being beaten, after being spat upon. You can imagine he's lost a great deal of blood already. Doing that walk to Golgotha, the walk itself would take a lot out of you, yet alone carrying a cross. Jesus is likely too weak to be able to finish that, and so they compel Simon to carry it for him. And Simon is believed to eventually become a Christian and become a pretty influential person. That's tradition. You don't read that in the Bible, but it's interesting nonetheless to point out. And another thing that's interesting about Simon, he's from Cyrene, but he has a very Jewish name. That kind of implies that he is part of the diaspora of Jews that were living sort of all over the place in the world at that time. And yet he's in Jerusalem, in that area, because presumably of the feast. And so we see that they take Jesus outside the city. You can see that in the language of verse 32, that they went out, which, again, you can see connotations here of going outside the camp. There's a lot of Jewish parallels here. They're not going to kill him in the city. They take him out. And they go instead to this place known as Golgotha. We read that in verse 33. And we read that it means place of skull. There's debate as to not only where Golgotha is specifically, but also how such a place could have gotten its name. Because that's kind of an important name. That's not something that you just get on accident, to be called the place of the skull. So what is the significance of this? Most people assume, and it makes sense, because we know Jesus is crucified on some sort of hill, if not a mountain. And it's possible that the area that they took him is shaped like a skull, where you have the various hills and so on, and the crevices or the flatter parts could sort of make up the eyes and the rest of the skull. And so if you had an aerial view, it could perhaps look like a skull. That's what most people believe. I don't know that I necessarily believe that. I'd have to go and see it myself. But it's an interesting thing nonetheless. Other theories surrounding this will say that this was a common place for executions. It makes sense. This is where they're taking him. They have a place already set aside where they're going to take him. And there's also in this the implication of uncleanness. This is a place of death. It's possible that there were skulls lying around from past executions. It's a very unclean place. That's why it's outside the city, and that's why they take him here, because they're going to do this unclean thing, of course, to Christ, the one who was sinless. Keep in mind, this all fits with the irony of the situation. So once he is at Golgotha, they offer him, and this is before they put him on the cross, they offer him wine mixed with gall. It's typically assumed that the reason they did this is to sort of help numb the pain. But there's something interesting going on here, because gall, if you're aware, is a bitter substance. That's what the word gall literally means. There's an old country song by Faron Young, Unmitigated Gall. And the idea of the song is this girl leaves this guy and then she has the unmitigated gall to come back like nothing ever happened. Well, that pertains to bitterness. It pertains to a disregard for things in that particular context. But gall is a bitter substance. And I tried looking up where gall even comes from. I'm not totally sure. It's some part of a fruit or a plant, some sort of it was described as like a tumor on plants that they cut off, and it's very bitter in taste. And this is what they mix with the wine, and they offer to Jesus. He tastes it, he realizes that it's bitter, and he doesn't want it. Well, it's interesting. It was common when someone's getting executed, I guess sort of as a lifeline or as a display of mercy, to offer them wine mixed with frankincense in order to numb or manage the pain. But this isn't wine with frankincense or even wine with myrrh like Mark says. This is wine with gall. So it raises the question, why do they offer Jesus wine mixed with gall, and why do they do this even before he's crucified? It seems that this is another form of mockery. Instead of offering Jesus something that's going to be helpful, something that's going to numb the pain, something that will make his suffering more manageable, something that is, I would say, humane. Instead of that, they give him something that's bitter. They give him something that he's not going to like, something that's not only helpful, but is actually unpleasant. There's also, and Matthew's intentional with this, some strong allusion here to Psalm 69 and verse 21. I usually really like the English Standard Version, but I don't like it here because they differ from the other translations. It says here, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. He'll get sour wine later when he's on the cross. I think the ESV calls it vinegar, as he's hanging on the cross before he dies. So that's going to happen later, the sour wine. But we see that they gave him poison for food, and I think every other English translation, they use the word gall here. And if you look at the Greek version of this text in the Septuagint, it's the same word that's used in Matthew 27. And so there's some obvious parallels here between what we read in Psalm 69 and what's happening to Jesus. They've offered him poison or gall. This is done not in a way that's going to be helpful, but in a way that adds to the mockery. And then finally, and I'm not a wine expert by any means, so if I say something that's not right about the wine, then you can correct me, but I don't like wine, so. And then finally, they crucify Jesus. This is what we've been waiting for. It happens in verse 35. But notice how briefly Matthew states this. It says in verse 35, it's not even the whole verse, it's like the first quarter of the verse, when he says, I got to go to the other page here, and when they had crucified him, they divided his garments. He says it in passing. This is, even in the original language, this is only 3 words. It literally reads, and crucifying him, and then they do this other thing. So, it's interesting when you look at this. This will come up, I think, in Jim's sermon this morning as well. We didn't plan on being in the same area in Matthew and in Luke, but we happen to be, although his won't overlap as much with mine, I don't think. But the other gospel accounts are also very brief in how they describe the crucifixion of Jesus. We don't read anything such as where they drove the nails. There's debate as to if it was through the hands or through the wrists. There's debate as to if the cross was a capital T or if it was a T with another bar on top. That's probably where they would have put his charge. There's debate on a lot of different aspects of the crucifixion, but we don't get any details. All we read in Matthew is, and crucifying him. That's how he puts it in the original language. He's very brief. Mark and Luke and John are also very brief. So it makes you wonder, why is it that perhaps the culmination of the entire story of the Bible, why is this so brief in saying, and crucifying him, and then they move on to the next thing? Why is this so brief? Why is it that Matthew simply mentions this in passing to get to the next point of when they divide his garments? Why is that? This question is phrased by one writer who put it this way: in all comparable literature, has so crucial a moment ever been phrased so briefly and uninformatively? We don't really know anything from what the gospel writers tell us about the crucifixion of Jesus, besides that it simply happened. They state it simply as a matter of fact, and then they move on to the next point. So why is it that it is this way? Davies and Allison, the main commentary that I read for Matthew, although it's not the only one, the other commentaries I use, they didn't make any mention of why Matthew and the other writers are so brief. This makes a world of sense. Davies and Allison say the dearth of details, which dearth means a lack of details, the dearth of details bespeaks a positive distaste for this most barbarous of ancient tortures. In other words, the gospel writers detest this so much that they don't go in details, they just simply mention it. And if you read this, and I felt this way this week as I was studying for this, you read this and it's hard to get through it without getting emotional, without getting angry, without feeling a lot of different emotions. Obviously gratitude for what Jesus was willing to do, but you read this and you get worked up a little bit, and it makes you wonder if when Matthew and also Mark and Luke and John, when they were writing this, if maybe to save their sanity, they just don't elaborate on it. Perhaps it's so detestable, and we understand that crucifixion was a shameful way to die, and we'll see that in what they do with Jesus. They want to make as little mention about it as possible because of the great distaste and disdain that they have for it. That makes sense to me. I don't know if it's a fully satisfactory answer, but that makes sense. So they crucify Jesus, and after he's crucified, his garments, his clothes, are divided among the soldiers. They cast lots for it. This implies, we don't think of this typically because it's strange to think of, but this implies that Jesus, as he's hanging on the cross, he's hanging naked. Think about that. Think of the spectacle that this is. This is a public setting. He's in a public place, and he's naked and not able to cover himself. You remember in the garden when Adam and Eve realized they were naked and they immediately covered themselves? And God made the coverings for them? Jesus is not able to do that. His arms are on either side. They're not able to move. He can't cover himself. And so this just adds to the shame of what is going on. Already being a public spectacle, hanging on a cross as a criminal, despite not being a criminal, and he is naked, which adds to the shame of it. He's already in a public spectacle, and this just multiplies it all the more. There's something else going on with the division of Jesus' garments. This is the beginning of several allusions, if not quotations, to Psalm 22. The division of Jesus' garments, we'll see another example here later, and we'll see this ultimately in what Jesus says on the cross when we get to verse 46. We'll get to that next week, Lord willing. But this is a strong allusion to Psalm 22 when in verse 18 of that psalm it mentions the dividing of garments by way of casting lots. So it says there in Psalm 22 in verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." I plan to go over Psalm 22 in more detail next week when Jesus actually says the beginning of it on the cross. But just know that there's a lot of allusions in this story as Jesus is hanging on the cross, culminated in his death. A lot of allusions to Psalm 22. And I think that psalm is saying something much bigger.
It's not just that someone dies, it's that he dies on the cross.
Right.
It's that in itself is a very strange thing. And that Jesus died on the cross. Remarkable thing.
Yeah, remarkable, I think, is an understatement. This is just an incredible thing to think about. Not incredible in a good way, but just the fact that you have an unguilty person, not just unguilty, but who's never sinned, period, who's dying the death of a criminal, dying a cruel, humiliating death, not just being executed, but being executed on a cross. There's a multiplier here that's going on. We see above Jesus' head his charge. If you're being executed, they're charging you with something, right? Whether it's murder or theft or whatever it would be. So what's the charge that they give to Jesus? Well, again, this adds to the mockery. And there's some double mockery going on here on the part of the Romans, because they're not just mocking Jesus, but they're mocking the Jews as well, as if to say, this is what we think of your king. We're going to kill him. They say, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. We've already seen this in the mockery before, when they kneel before him and they shout, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now they have this charge above his head. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Well, this is, again, very ironic, because they're not sincere in saying it, and yet they're speaking the truth. They are proclaiming the truth of who Jesus is. What the Romans used as mockery, again, not just to Jesus, but even to the Jews themselves, For Christians, this is a statement of faith. Jesus is my king. I will follow him. And this is also, keep in mind, an appeal for Matthew's Jewish audience. Jesus is your king. Jesus is the one you need to follow. Are you going to do it? That's what Matthew is appealing to his readers to do. And the charge that they put above Jesus' head is a great way to draw them to that conclusion, showing through the irony of who Jesus really is. Notice, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, before he breathed his final breath, notice the shame and the scorn that he's enduring. There's already a lot of shame in just simply being there and being there without clothing. But notice the things that he goes through while he's there. In verse 38, we read that he's crucified with robbers on either side of him. He's dying the death of a criminal, surrounded by criminals. What's interesting is Matthew doesn't mention the story of the thief on the cross. That's interesting to point out. We see that he's crucified with robbers on either side of him. They're going to come up later because they're going to join in the mocking of Jesus as he's hanging there on the cross. Speaking of gall, the gall of those guys to do that. He's crucified with robbers. We read that he is derided. The Greek word that is used for that is blasphemeo. Sounds like the word blasphemy. That's where we get that word from. They are blaspheming Jesus. He's blasphemed by people who are passing by and who are wagging their heads at him, as if to say, this fella. Well, again, this is an allusion to Psalm 22. We read in Psalm 22 in verse 7, all who see me mock me. We've seen that already. We're going to continue to see it. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. The wagging of the heads is a specific thing that Matthew mentions. And we see that is an allusion, again, to Psalm 22. He's going to reference Psalm 22 quite a bit. We see also that he is mocked by the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. These are the people that are directly responsible for Jesus' death, in particular the chief priests, but the scribes and the elders have been in on it throughout the entirety of the gospel account. And we read of what they say, starting in verse 41, where the chief priests say, in verse 42, he saved others, he cannot save himself, he's the king of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusts in God, let God deliver him now, if he desires him, for he said, I am the king, or I am the Son of God. Their mockery, and not just their mockery, but also the mockery of the passers-by previously, reminds me a lot of something that the devil said to Jesus in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. You may remember the temptations of Jesus, and I'll have it on the screen here in a moment, but the devil tempts Jesus. Jesus, of course, overcomes the temptation. But what we see here is the Jewish leaders are behaving in the same way as the devil himself, in more ways than one, certainly in the things that they say. But again, there's a strong allusion, if not even a quotation, from Psalm 22. First, let's look at Matthew 4. So they say, as Jesus is hanging there on the cross, he's the king of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross. Well, the devil says to Jesus in Matthew 4 and verse 6, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, as he's on the pinnacle of the temple. You see similar language that's used. The devil says, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. Here the Jewish leaders say, take yourself down from that cross. You say you're the Son of God, why don't you do that? Prove it to us. They're tempting Jesus the same way that the devil tempted him. And then this from Psalm 22. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. We see that here in verse 43, where it says, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. So we see again an allusion, if not even a quotation, from Psalm 22 in the way that the Jewish leaders are mocking Jesus. We also see he's even reviled, and reviled is a strong word. He's insulted, reviled by the criminals who were crucified with him. You have people there on either side of him that have committed a crime. Matthew calls them robbers. Presumably, Jesus has taken the place of Barabbas, who they freed before. We read that Barabbas, I think Mark describes him as someone who was guilty of murder in the sedition or in the attempted overthrow of what's going on. But presumably, Jesus takes Barabbas' place on the cross, which in doing so, he also takes your place and my place. But that's a deeper point. But we see that he is reviled by the criminals who are there with him. So these are the ones who are actually guilty, who are actually deserving of what they're getting. You have Jesus in the middle, not guilty of anything, and is in fact dying for them as he died for you and for me, and yet they have the gall, to use that word again, to mock him. What we have presented here in this story, as Jesus is on the cross, is a triad of mockery. And Matthew does this pretty often. He likes to take things in groups of three. 3 is a good biblical number. You have the spectators, you have the Jewish leaders, then you have the criminals. They are all mocking Jesus as he's on the cross. And this just adds, and it multiplies, the shame and the scorn that Jesus is going through on the cross. And we need to remember, he didn't have to do that. As he said before, he could call the legions of angels and they could save him. He could come down from that cross if he wanted to. Yet he stayed up there, not by force, by his own will, following the will of the Father. And he did that for you and for me. And that's something that, for Matthew's readers, would be a strong appeal to follow Jesus. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
I'd like to mention the people that Jesus picked out to go preach the gospel. Each one of them gave their life and suffered many things to preach the gospel, to show how much they believed that this all took place and was real. You know? You don't sacrifice your life for nothing.
Yeah, Garfield points out the fact that the apostles were willing to die. They wouldn't die for something that was a lie. Some of them even were killed in a similar manner as Jesus. It's believed that Peter was sentenced to be crucified, and he said, well, crucify me upside down then. I'm not worthy to die the same death that Jesus died. And so they all suffered great things for the cause of the gospel, and they wouldn't do it for a lie. And even secular people acknowledge the fact that Jesus was a real person. He did appear before Pilate, and he was crucified. That's something even people who don't believe that Jesus is the Christ or the Son of God, they have to acknowledge that because there's overwhelming historical evidence of it, not just from the Gospels, but from writers like Josephus and many others who testify to the fact that Jesus was a real person and he was crucified. We'll see eventually that he did raise from the dead. You have something, Amos?
I was thinking about in John when Lazarus was raised from the dead and the plea to help Lazarus before he died. Jesus went one step further. He waited till Lazarus did die. He had a lot of witnesses. And then here we are now. Jesus is still alive on the cross, and you got people making a mockery of Jesus while he's still alive. And he's going to go one step further. You can tempt me to come down off that cross and all that. He said, wait 3 or 4 more days and we'll take care of business. You know, I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to be resurrected. And then what are you going to do? You know, all of these mockers and scoffers. The power that comes through his resurrection. Should humble them.
Yeah.
Should have humbled them.
Amos makes a point, and he compares it to what Jesus does with Lazarus in John. He doesn't save Lazarus before he dies. He raises him from the dead after he dies. And after he'd been dead for a long time, the body was stinking. It was 4 days, I think, he was in the tomb.
Yeah, 4 days.
Jesus, he could have taken himself down off the cross, but there's a greater sign that he can do. God's going to raise him from the dead. That's the greatest sign of them all. That's the sign that beats all the other signs. That one they are not able to deny.
Jesus' power over death.
Yeah. All right, we're out of time. Thank you.